Our conversation this evening is with Ethan Zuckerman. He is director of the MIT Center for Civic Media. He is a graduate of Williams College, a Fulbright scholar, and studied at the University of Ghana. Mr. Zuckerman is an internet activist, a blogger, and a visionary. In 2011, Foreign Policy magazine designated him a top global thinker for his insight that the world is not flat and globalization is only beginning, which means we have time to change what we're doing and get it right. When we spoke earlier this week, you talked about the correlation between civic engagement in a digital age where there are low levels of trust. So to begin, what are some metrics of that low level of trust and how do they intersect with our participation in the digital age?
So one way to think about this is the Gallup poll has been asking Americans for more than 50 years now whether they have a lot or some trust in the government to do the right thing most of the time. That number hit a peak of about 74 under the Eisenhower administration. It has had a steep fall ever since then. It did not hit a low point under Nixon. It's kept going down. So I was born in 1973. Since I was born, that number has only once been over 50%, and that was right before we invaded Iraq, which would have been a very good time to be slightly less trusting of the government. What's interesting is that it's not just a loss of trust in government, it's a loss of trust in institutions. So if you ask people the same question about corporations, big banks, you ask it about NGOs, you ask it about universities, you ask it about virtually anything with the exception of the police and the military, and it's been falling over the last 40 years. Across the board, you have young people looking at the world and saying, I'm not sure I trust any of these institutions. And that raises a very difficult question about what you should do as an engaged citizen at a moment of very high mistrust.
So when everyone goes online, looks for information, whether it's written or on video, does the trust factor come in there anywhere?
Well, they don't trust us either. So the good news is that it's not that they've shifted their trust somehow from newspapers to the internet. People trust their friends, they trust their families, they trust people known to them. Eurobarometer, which is one of the big surveys that's looked at trust in Europe, found that what people most trust is people like them. That seems to be what's really come out of the internet. It's this different sense of authenticity. So rather than essentially looking for an institution or an authority, people are looking for people who look like them. And there's all sorts of problems that come from shifting our trust from institutions, no matter how flawed they are, into people who look like us. It's actually a very easily manipulated tendency.
And it also seems to suggest that instead of our access to the world via the web, broadening our understanding, broadening our desire to get to know more about other people in our world around us, that it's doing the opposite?
So for me, this is one of the central tragedies of the last 20 years. I got online very early. I got online in about 1988. And I realized how important being able to be online was for the first time in 1993, because I was about to move to Accra, Ghana. I was leaving a town of 8,000 people in western Massachusetts, moving to a city of 3 million on a continent I had never visited before. And I was able to go on to this early proto-internet, these message boards called Usenet, and basically say, hey, I'm looking for Ghanaians. Can people tell me what to expect, what to bring, what to do? And found people, including people that I remain friends with to this day. And so to me, as a 20-year-old college kid in 1993, the internet was this open door to relationships with people that I had never met and might not meet unless I got on an airplane and moved to another country. Fast forward now 22 years. That promise that the internet was magically going to connect us to people of other languages, cultures, religions, that hasn't played out the way that many of us hoped. We really thought the internet was going to become a borderless space. What's happened in many ways is we are likely, most of us, getting less information about the rest of the world than we were in the 1970s.
You've said that there were some dumb assumptions made about what connectedness would do. Now, you've just mentioned interpersonal relationships, but what about what it was supposed to do with respect to changing government, changing financial institutions, getting around censorship, for example?
I mostly teach master's and doctoral students at an engineering university. I teach at MIT. And the main thing that I try to teach them over the 2 to 7 years I have with them is that technologies always have assumptions behind them. And those assumptions are political. Whether you mean for them to be political or not, those assumptions are inbuilt into the technology. The politics of the early internet were actually pretty clear. We were hoping for something that was truly global. We wanted it to be as decentralized as possible. We believed that it was going to end old monopolies. We believed that it might be impossible to create new monopolies. We believed that the internet interpreted censorship as damage and routed around it. Boy, were we wrong. I mean, you may remember when we were sort of celebrating unseating Microsoft. Now we've got, sort of a Facebook-Google duopoly. I'd throw Apple in there as another big, powerful player. These guys have immense amount of control. We had no idea that we were going to centralize back around there. Censorship has proved incredibly robust, not just in China and Iran, but now in Russia, which has taken on wholesale internet censorship, even in places like Ethiopia, where you wouldn't even imagine that the internet would be enough of a problem that there would be massive censorship and, in fact, arrests of people writing online. So we got many, many things wrong. The biggest thing we got wrong, I think, is that a lot of the people who were involved with the internet in the early 1990s saw this as changing politics, saw this as making it possible for us to have a direct voice, to influence candidates and leaders directly. I am baffled in some ways that we haven't ended up with more direct democracy over the course of the last 20 plus years. But that now seems like a really passé idea. It seems like a very 1990s idea, whereas 2015 seems all about how do we create new world-beating commercial monopolies. That seems to be the current landscape and the current values.
But wait a minute, with respect to political engagement, what about Occupy? What about the Ferguson movement? And what about all of the Arab Spring? Let's just start with Occupy.
So let's unpack these a little bit, right? So Occupy is a movement coming out of the Arab Spring in many ways. Arab Spring in many ways sort of inspires people to sort of go out in the street. What we need to understand about the Arab Spring and about Occupy is that counterpower is a lot easier than power. So here's what I mean about this. My site, Global Voices site that I helped co-found, sort of an international citizen media network, many of our correspondents were involved with the Arab Spring in Tunisia. So we had the nice journalistic advantage of we could report on this because we were going out in the streets and then sort of reporting on it after the fact. My best Tunisian correspondent had to drop off the story because he was named the Minister of Youth and Sport in the new government. What we found out from those protests in Tunisia was that you could get a lot of different people from Tunisian society together to say, we're done with Ben Ali, let's get rid of him. And it was the same thing in Egypt with Mubarak. It was really, really easy to rally people against. When you tried to get people together and sort of say, how should we govern? How do we work on this? That's turned out to be much harder.
Let's talk for just a second, maybe slightly off track, about an historical comparison. The anti-war movement, for example, which started out on a few college campuses and expanded to other college campuses, and before you know it, it's all over the country. The Vietnam anti-war movement, for those of you under a certain age. That did work, did it not, to create some political change. You would think that when you get a lot of people together, that you can effect political change. But what you're saying is with the Arab Spring, you got a lot of people together and the political change they sought didn't happen?
So if you think about what happens after the anti-war movement, you end up with a kind of a dark and difficult time in American politics. You end up with some pretty unsuccessful one-term presidents. You end up with a conservative backlash, bringing in Reagan for 8 years. In many ways, the people who really trained on the anti-war movement don't show up until the Clinton administration in terms of presidential power. They're building different forms of institutional power. And there's no way to sort of say that the leaders of the Arab Spring won't be the new leaders in the Middle East 10 or 20 years from now. But it's been very, very hard to get from point A to point B. And I think this is true with Occupy as well. I think what's happening, and here I'm borrowing completely from my dear friend Zeynep Tufekci, an amazing Turkish-American academic who studied the protests in Turkey around Gezi Park. And she said, look, this is really hard to understand. You had more than 1 million Turks taking to the streets in 60 different cities. You had an amazing diversity of people coming together, from the far right-wing nationalists to gay and lesbian Turks, showing up to protest Erdogan. And then 6 months later, you have him elected with the largest majority ever to run the country. What happened there? And her answer to what happened there was, you can get people out into the streets much more easily than you ever have been able to before. What's really hard is once you get them out into the streets, they don't necessarily have much in common. Those far-right religious Turks, they're not holding hands with the guys dressed in lavender fighting for gay rights in Istanbul. And trying to build a movement out of that, which took years in the civil rights movement, took years in the anti-war movement, you can get people into the streets in a day now, but it's much, much more fragile. Ferguson, which you ask about, is something different. Ferguson, to me, is a movement that isn't focused on political power so much as it's focused on media power. When we saw Black Lives Matter emerge as a hashtag as well as a protest movement, this is what we call in the media space a reframing. This essentially says these things, these aren't point incidents. We had 101 unarmed African Americans shot by police in the United States in 2014. Not until you have Black Lives Matter do you have this sort of clear narrative coming out of this that essentially says, this is the manifestation of systemic racism in the US, and this is how we have evidence that we are not, in fact, living in a post-racial society. That reframing isn't just happening in the streets, it's happening in the media.
Let's talk for a minute about your book, those of you who haven't seen it, Digital Cosmopolitans, Why We Think the Internet Connects Us, Why It Doesn't, and How to Rewire It. It's a lot there. Let's take the first part. Why we think the internet connects us.
I write in this book about a phenomenon that I call imaginary cosmopolitanism. Imaginary cosmopolitanism is this idea that we have access to news and information from all over the world. The funny thing is, if you actually look at what people are paying attention to day to day, moment to moment, some of those imbalances of what we pay attention to are worse than they were in the 1970s. So mainstream media has actually moved to spending about 40% of the news cycle on broadcast television on international stories, down below 15%.
Today.
It's been a long, steady fall from the 1970s to today. You've seen a similar fall in most major US newspapers. The New York Times actually has done an admirable job of sort of keeping it up. See the same thing in the UK. So within mainstream media, you see less and less and less of the international voice. The hope was that with new media, you would suddenly see a flourishing of voices from the rest of the world. And the answer is people are speaking, but in most cases, they're not getting heard. When you start doing a content analysis of those really popular websites, the Huffington Post, the Slates, the Salons, they are often more US-centric, more Europe-centric than even the mainstream publications, even after their long slide. We saw a really clear sense of this earlier this year when you had the attacks on Charlie Hebdo. Charlie Hebdo got an amazing amount of media attention. The world swung around, decided to pay attention to a story about Islamic terror crushing freedom of speech. There was another really interesting story going on that same week. Boko Haram ended up wiping out the village of Baga in northern Nigeria. More than 2,000 people killed, more than 10,000 people chased from their homes. We had something like 1/100th of the media attention in US media. Nigerian media didn't even pay as much attention to Baga as they did to Charlie Hebdo because it was such a big global story. So we have the capacity to get these stories from every part of the globe. We've got mobile phones. We've got internet connectivity. We can live stream what's going on. The question is, what do we want to pay attention to? And the crazy thing that's happened over 20 years of the consumer internet is that we have told the market that we care about people who look like us, act like us, feel like us, and we don't much care about anybody else.
Wow. Next part. Why doesn't it bring us closer together?
Because the internet tends to reinforce some very basic sociological forces. The one that I write about it the most in the book is one called homophily, which is the tendency of birds of a feather to flock together. If you look within sociology, there is almost no phenomenon as well documented as homophily. People have done studies where they'll watch students walk into a computer lab and look to see who they'll sit down next to. And statistically speaking, I will sit down to someone with glasses. I'll sit down to someone who's white. We are remarkably good at this. When you interview students and sort of ask them, why did you sit down next to someone who looks like you? They say, they look nice. On some basic level, we know how to find our tribe. And we define our tribe quite narrowly. Now, the interesting thing is that the internet makes this much easier to do. So everyone here, if you join Facebook, try to think back to that moment when you joined Facebook. For me, it's so far in the past, I have to rejoin Facebook every couple of years just to check. Facebook tries to find your tribe. The first thing it says is, where did you go to high school? Where did you go to college? Where did you go to elementary school? Where did you grow up? Where have you worked? Now, the first thing it's doing is it's trying to find you 10 friends. They know that if it finds you 10 friends, you'll stay on the network and use it. But what they end up doing is finding your earliest identities. They find the community that you came from. And because Americans tend to self-sort racially, religiously, in terms of the neighborhoods we live in, it puts you into often a racially and religiously segregated group. Wherever you've gone on in life, Facebook wants to remind you that you're from Mississippi, I'm from upstate New York, and we've both got our different communities that we sort of find ourselves within. Now, they don't do this because they're evil or they want to prevent global communication. They do it because it's highly profitable. But think about what would happen. Think about what would happen if someone built a social network designed to challenge you.
Is that the rewiring?
It's one possible thing you do with rewiring. I've got a student right now named Sans Fish who is trying to build social networks designed to make you uncomfortable. He basically, the first thing he does is he takes away the choice of friends. You no longer have a choice about who's going to be your friend. You're going to interact with people who he thinks you should be interacting with as a way of sort of challenging this. Will anyone use this? It's a good question. This is why you do this at research universities rather than going out and getting venture capital for it. A lot of my theories around this suggest that you need bridge figures. You need people who you have one thing in common with, but something else that's very different. I spend a ton of my life right now working on technology and innovation in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I work with people who I don't have a lot in common with in terms of where we grew up, who we know, where we're from, but we have a lot in common in terms of what we do day to day, how we interact with technological systems, the things that we care about. That gives us a common ground that we're able to work on.
Why have you chosen in your personal life to focus on Sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, you could have focused on, I don't know, Mexico?
I had the incredible opportunity when I was 20 years old to move to Accra, Ghana. It's the only city I've ever lived in my life. I'm a rural boy, but I lived in an amazing cosmopolitan city of 3 million people. And my life was completely transformed by suddenly having my very small, rural, white, Western Massachusetts existence opened up to people who are living in very, very different ways in very, very different places. And when I came back to the United States, the questions that I got were so dumb.
Give me an example.
Weren't you afraid of being mauled by lions? Living in an apartment building in the downtown of a city of 3 million people. No, I was actually pretty afraid of the Giardia on the water, but I was not particularly afraid of lions, particularly since they're not native to West Africa. But people would ask you this question with a straight face. Wasn't it incredibly dangerous? No. This is a stable, peaceful country. It has been since 1957, when it's the first country to gain independence from European colonialism. But so what happened was moving to West Africa got me studying media. It got me working in the high-tech field to sort of think about whether the transformations that I was seeing in the US might transform West Africa. And I started a nonprofit that started doing work first in Ghana and then in 14 different countries on helping people get technology businesses off the ground. When I discovered that you could not get Americans to invest money in sub-Saharan Africa, then I felt like I had to get on the media problem and had to start thinking about this question of why in the year 2000, when Ghana had a free and fair election in which the opposition party won, you may remember our election in 2000 didn't go so smooth here. My very dear friend, Kobe Kumson, who was Ghana's ambassador to the US, faxed Bill Clinton offering Ghanaian election observers to come into Florida to show them how it was done. That Ghanaian election, one of the most important elections on the African continent, an election that demonstrated that democracy was there to stay in Ghana, got almost no play in US media. And so that's the question that I've now been wrestling with really for the last 15 years or so. If we think of that not just as an unpleasant phenomenon, but a question of social justice. How do you get to a world where people are taking the ability for sub-Saharan Africans to have economic and democratic progress and to take that seriously? How do we address that? How do we address that attention gap as a social justice issue?
You were part of the founding of one of the first social media companies back in the mid-90s.
Tripod.com.
And I'm wondering, at that point, or maybe prior, who was thinking about ethics? I mean, when you talk about the legal profession or the medical profession or other professions, they are either internal governing bodies and rules or government bodies and rules. Who deals with those kinds of issues with digital media?
If you wind the clock back to the 1990s, I think we would have told you that by building companies that let people publish whatever they wanted to publish, we were doing the ethical thing. I would have pulled out the example of Malaysia, where most of the opposition politicians, including Anwar Ibrahim, had web pages on our server because they couldn't find another way to publish within Malaysia. But we believed with almost religious certainty that the internet was going to take care of a lot of these problems that we were worried about. Fast forward 20 years, it's quite clear, and I've written a whole book about it, that it's just not that easy. That every technology has assumptions, has politics baked into it, but they're not always exactly what you thought. We really thought that by giving the microphone to hundreds of thousands, millions of people, that it would change the politics, that it would change inclusion, and there are so many things that we got wrong in the process. So fast forward now, you have companies facing incredibly deep moral issues. Right now, we're collecting huge amounts of data on people. You can, by correlating that data, determine someone's creditworthiness with a high degree of accuracy not by knowing anything about their financial transactions, but by knowing about their social network. If you just know who someone is friends with, you know some other details about it, you can make a very, very good guess at someone's credit score. We're going to start seeing digital redlining. We're going to start seeing forms of big data used for discrimination because it's profitable. And this is a moment at which we desperately need people coming and working in these technological fields who have a very deep moral and ethical grounding and have a really deep understanding that the technology, whether you want it to be or not, ends up being political. This is why now, sort of 20 plus years into my career, I feel like the best thing that I can be doing is trying to teach these brilliant engineers coming out of MIT, not to teach them how to build better or more profitable systems, but how to ask those critical questions about what those systems are and are not going to do, and to try to figure out how to bring ethics onto the table when they're sort of building those companies.
Thank you, sir, for sharing with us your vision and your knowledge.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.